So we're going to be reacting to a second thought video.
It's Second Thought's message to the International Department of the Communist Party USA for the 2023 International Conference.
Got it. So it's like a little like cute club.
Yeah.
I mean, that was condescending, but like, I mean, what does the Communist Party USA do these days?
They shill for China. And
I would assume it's mostly like historical projects, right? Like they're mostly just like saying, oh, wasn't Gus Hall cool? Wasn't he a cool guy? Or they're just like I don't even know what they would like. They're not participating in elections, are they? Do they run candidates that win anything ever?
As far as I know, they basically just promote Biden. I don't know if they're still doing that.
Wait, they don't promote Biden. There's no way they did it.
I swear to God, they've been promoting the Democratic Party for a while. They at least were promoting the Democrats during the 2016 election. I have no idea what their line.
I could imagine them maybe promoting Bernie or someone like that specifically, but there's no way they were like, vote for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's our guy in 2020. I refuse to believe that. There's no way. Yeah, but anyway, it's Communist Party USA, CPUSA. Got you. Okay, so he's recording this for CPUSA. So he's a communist. He's a member of the Communist Party.
I don't actually know if he is, but he got asked to speak at it. Luna Oi also got asked to speak, and they had the Chinese delegation as well.
Got you. Is Luna Oi Ukrainian?
Not the last time I checked.
Is Second Thought Ukrainian? Is anyone in the video that we're gonna watch of this message to the CPUSA on Ukrainian?
There might be like a Ukrainian stock footage, man, at some point in the video.
Got you. So you're telling me that they could get somebody from Vietnam.
Yeah.
But they couldn't get somebody from Ukraine. I can understand the American. Okay. Second Thought, he's an American. It's CPUSA. That makes sense, right? But Luna Oi lives in Vietnam. Why is she somebody who doesn't have any tie to the conflict and also is an American as far as I know?
I don't think she actually talks about Vietnam in her video, because like it's a whole bunch of different videos from different delegations. So they have like a Honduras delegation and a Chilean and a Chinese.
Oh, so is this like an international thing? It's like they're getting all the international communist parties. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. But wait. So they get all the international communist parties, but they couldn't get any Ukrainian. Okay, well let's watch it. I'm very interested in watching.
If they got anyone from Ukraine, they probably would have wanted to get like the leaders from the Ukrainian Communist Party, but I'm pretty sure they're in jail right now.
I don't think they're in jail. I think, but the Ukrainian Communist Party is no longer allowed. And I mean, it was acting as a proxy for the Russian government. The thing is, it's crazy about communist parties in Eastern Europe, definitely in post-Soviet states, is they're very not concentrated on developing communism. It's very strange. I don't want to get
100%.
I don't know how much I want to get into the history of the Ukrainian Communist Party right now. But maybe they'll talk about it in the video. Okay, so how are we gonna watch it?
I have shared it in my Discord.
There we go.
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Here we go.
In late February of 2022, Russia officially began what it has since called its special military operation in Ukraine. While this event marked a significant escalation in violence between the two countries, it was not where the conflict began. Nearly a decade ago, the United States and European imperialist powers backed a far-right coup in Ukraine that overthrew the elected government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the US's Cold War rival. At the time, this was seen as a clear provocation by the United States and an attempt to gain a foothold to launch an eventual.
Yeah, all of that's a lie. I don't even know where to start. Like, that was just like very blatant. So the first thing he says, they backed a far-right coup. The Euromaidan wasn't a far-right movement. It was a movement that was across the political spectrum, that had issues that overlapped on corruption, on pro-democracy, checks and balances, a whole host of issues. There were far-right people in it. Right Sector, who I've interviewed Right Sector fighters before, and they're definitely ultra-nationalist right wing. They were part of it. That's actually how they started their movement, was as to respond to police violence during Euromaidan. But the things that united people around Euromaidan, they were bipartisan issues. For example, police violence and racketeering within the special forces, the Berkut, which responded to protests in the very violently. Euromaidan started because Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine at the time, retracted on the deal that he promised in 2012 when he was running for office, that he would enter with the European Union, called the Association Agreement. It would allow visa-free travel. It would allow building of good economic ties with Ukraine. But then the Russians strong-armed him. They engaged in economic coercion, which they promised they wouldn't do when they signed the Budapest Memorandum back in the day. That's when Ukraine gave up its nuclear stockpile. But Yanukovych seceded to their demands. He retracted his earlier promise, and he pulled out of it, and it looked like he was going to, instead of joining the association agreement, join the Russian economic alliance instead, which is not what the majority of Ukrainians want. It was in direct contrast to what he promised on the campaign trail. He announced it in the middle of the night, which was meant to depress response, because if you announce it at midnight or like 1 a.m., most people are going to be asleep, less people to go out and protest. Some people, though, did. He responded to those protests violently. That was responded to by the whole nation very angrily when they saw these mostly students getting beaten with metal pipes and being treated very violently. That made the protests grow, and then Euromaidan exploded from there. And that message of being against police violence, being against corruption, being against the Russian government's coercion against Ukraine integrating with the European Union more, these are values that Ukrainian liberals, Ukrainian conservatives, Ukrainian nationalists, like all types of different Ukrainians agreed. So to call it like a far right coup is already like, you're already poisoning the well to say it's far right. And when you talk about the coup, that's interesting because there was a protest movement that grew against the government at the time, and eventually that caused Yanukovych to flee the country. But he only fled the country after murdering like dozens of protesters and trying to outlaw protesting, making it so nobody can form a crowd larger than 3 people. And if I know anything about Second Thought's history, if Joe Biden released a law that more people of making a crowd more than 3 people will be arrested, that's illegal, that's banned, I think that he would not side with Joe Biden. And I feel that this is kind of just, switching out, your critique or turning off your critical thinking because Ukraine is an American ally, and therefore we have to take whatever position is against the Ukrainian government. He says that it was very clear that this was a provocation by the United States to the international community. Bullshit. There was disagreement about how the United States should respond. But when he says that it was backed, there was a lot of people who were condemning how the Russians were treating Ukraine during this period. But putting that aside, when he talks about, can we hear that? Can we hear that again? I know we're still on the first 5 minutes, but this is just like, for sure. They're poisoning the well from the start. Just go back 20 seconds or something. Oh yeah, wait, no, I remembered what it was. He said it was a U.S. backed coup. The United States did
far-right coup in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The United States did support the protesters, but when they say U.S. backed, he doesn't give any detail. That makes it sound like we sent guns or we sent like munitions. What it really meant is that we sent politicians and they were like, "You guys are cool. Keep it up."
They're trying to make it sound like it's a Pinochet sort of situation, and it's obviously not.
No. I mean, honestly, it makes it sound like when you look at this footage, it makes it sound like we gave these guys guns or we told them to take over buildings or anything. When if you listen to the Victoria Nuland phone call that people talk about all the time, she explicitly states that they hope that they accepted the deal with the Yanukovych government, but they didn't. The protesters didn't, and that was because they weren't like heeding to the beck and call of the United States. They had their own interests at play, which was the sovereignty, both economic and geopolitical, of Ukraine. Anyway, sorry I rambled so much, but he said so much so fast.
I really do appreciate your positions on this, especially because like Second Thought has a huge influence.
Oh yeah,
and
his
this isn't
gigantic
the kind of stuff
following.
that Yeah, this is not the kind of stuff that he would actually say on his main channel. He keeps it really milquetoast and lukewarm, but then he goes to the CPUSA International Conference and says, like, the Ukrainian government is a far-right puppet regime of the U.S. imperialists, and Russia has, like, they have all the right to invade and take over the country. It's fucking crazy to me that he can get away with this kind of thing.
That overthrew the elected government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the U.S.'s Cold War rival.
Pause.
At the time,
I
this was seen as a clear provocation.
I'm sorry.
To the United States.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I forgot the puppet regime part. They had a democratic election. They had an election, and Poroshenko won. Poroshenko, by the way, used to be a member of Yanukovych's political party. So if Poroshenko is the far right, like, Nazi, and by the way, I do think Poroshenko is pretty right wing. But the way that they're describing it, they're not right wing in the way they're describing it, right? I mean, like, right wing in the way that, like, those gays are icky. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, but both sides of this conflict are, like, Eastern Europe is a very socially conservative.
I think there's a difference because of, like, the law's implementation, and Ukraine's making progress as more recently. But Poroshenko, much more conservative than Zelensky. Much more conservative, much more a member of the old guard. But Poroshenko won an election. He ran an election when Yanukovych fled the country because he murdered a bunch of people and he wasn't going to get away with it. They had an interim government, and then they had an election, which all international monitors said was free and fair. And then when Poroshenko had another election in 2019, he lost and Zelensky replaced him. So if it's a puppet regime, it's kind of weird that the elections actually are changing the hands of the guard, and that the Ukrainian government has been so, critical of the United States and critical of many Western allies, and a lack of support towards Ukraine. And we've seen that, for example, recently with the NATO conference. So I don't think calling Ukraine a puppet of the United States is accurate. Not to mention the fact, one of the best ways you can see this is to investigate the intelligence sharing between the United States and Ukraine. The United States gives a lot of intelligence to Ukraine to assist them in the war. But the American Intelligence Agency says that they probably know more about the Russians in Ukraine than the Ukrainians in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians keep such a tight lip and are very hesitant to share any information with the Americans due to the possibility of a leak. And the Jack Textera leaks kind of, in a way, validated them, or at least in the eyes of many, validated them. If they're a puppet, how can they keep information from us like that? If they're a puppet, why can they criticize, and why do they openly criticize us like they do? If they're a puppet, why was it that they didn't do what Victoria Nuland wanted them to do back in 2014? It is this way. They're trying to remove the autonomy of Ukrainian people. And this is one of the main complaints I hear from Ukrainians when they hear Western commentators talk about them, is that they're talked about as if they're all puppets, as he just mentioned, as he just referenced them as puppets.
That's the one thing I really hate. It never feels like Ukrainians are given any sort of autonomy in these kind of conversations. It's either they're all puppets of Western powers, or they're all Nazis that the Russians need to denazify, and they need to be the caretakers of the land or something.
Yep. Even though the whole time, by the way, because the Russians have far-right neo-Nazi militias that have been fighting on their side since 2014. Rusich is the greatest example of this. Openly neo-Nazi militia. When I say openly neo-Nazi, I don't mean they like tiptoe around it, but they like do a little Zikhal in the background. As in, their leadership, when asked in interviews, say, "Oh no, I'm not a patriot. Don't describe me as a nationalist. I am a Nazi." Like, openly. And so I don't understand how the far-right element really comes into play here, if the far right is being deployed against the far right to battle Nazis. So is the idea that the Nazis have been deployed to fight the Nazis in this crusade against Nazism. It just, I don't know. The far right element, in my opinion, is somewhat overdone, at least from a Russian context, in a Russian context. I do think there's a place and a time to talk about the far right in Ukraine, or a way to talk about them. I think you can. I've interviewed them, and I've talked about it before. Recently in Ukraine, right sector has been getting a lot of criticism due to their somewhat transphobic attacks towards a trans member of the military. and they've been getting dragged for a lot of their rhetoric against the LGBTQ plus community, at least in the circles that I navigate in. I've been seeing that a lot on social media. So there's a way to talk about these organizations. It's just they only ever get talked about in the context of Russian imperialism, and to try to embolden the claim of Russian imperialism, as if, don't worry, to get rid of your far-right maniacs, we have even crazier, even more far-right maniacs to take over.
That really is the logic of, like, the only way to deal with a bad guy with a gun is having a gun.
An even worse guy with a gun.
Yeah, even worse. Okay, we got 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know. I cannot. He talks very fast.
I have not pre-watched this. I got through like the first minute, and then I was like, I need your opinion, Dylan.
And an attempt to gain a foothold to launch an eventual proxy war in the region. A reality which has been conveniently swept under the rug in recent years.
No, he's saying this like this is like a determined fact. Like, everyone knew in 2014 that the intention was to establish a puppet regime in Ukraine so that America could launch a proxy. No, they didn't. I don't remember that Timothy Snyder article. That's a historian on Ukraine. I don't remember that. I don't remember those pieces that, oh, this is all intended for the, I don't know, maybe Rayzone was saying that, but that was not widely accepted consensus, especially since it was the Russians who then proceeded to launch the invasions of Ukraine, based off of claims like ethnic issues that Putin was saying wasn't an issue 6 years ago after he invaded Georgia, in order to soothe concerns that maybe one day he would invade Ukraine. The whole time lying about invading Ukraine. I don't know. What he's saying right now is not true. It was not consensus, or everyone knew that this is all to launch a proxy war against the Russians. No, that's not the case.
But even this thinly veiled threat cannot be considered the true beginning of the conflict. We'd have to go all the way back to the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union to really understand
the illegal dissolution.
The undermining and
Yeah, because he's going by the fact that they had a referendum. And even though the majority of the people who voted in this referendum wanted the USSR to stay together, it ended up dissolving anyway.
Well, no, that's bullshit. That's not even true. That's not even what it was. If I'm remembering
I'm just going by their own logic.
Yeah,
this is the shit they drilled into my head when I was in the party.
As far as, if I remember correctly, there was a referendum that would have reformed the USSR in a way, and people voted in favor of that. And then there was another vote later to dissolve and leave the USSR, and then the Ukrainians also voted in favor of that. Overwhelmingly in every single province, including Crimea, by the way. It was a new union treaty. So this is deceptive. This is specifically leaving out certain information. There's something crazy would have to happen in the 1 year period between those votes. If out of nowhere, 90% of the Ukrainian population just turned against the Soviets in 1 year. I don't know what they did in that time. I mean, Gorbachev is not the coolest, but I mean, that's like crazy. That's a crazy turnaround. So yeah, no, it's just deceptive.
Eventual destruction of the original socialist project, the brutal and sadistic economic shock therapy that followed, and the fragmenting of what had once been a strong and united people. The moment the Second World War ended, this is why they didn't bring on any Ukrainians, because no Ukrainian would ever.
This is a true story. So like when I was still in the party, like one of my best friends is from Ukraine, immigrated to Canada when they were 14. And they saw that I was like getting really into like this old guard Marxist Leninist shit. So they decided to like open up some of their history textbooks that they had. And they started getting so fucking mad because they don't give a single shit. They like erase Ukrainian people from these textbooks. They keep using the term Soviet people, but they're never actually talking about Ukrainians. It's always just Russians.
There's a lot of claiming of Ukrainian culture as Russian culture, or like an extension of Russian culture. There was a lot of that. But the thing is, if you look at like polling data today on how like Stalin is viewed in Ukraine, it's like in versus Russia. In Russia, it's like 60% like Stalin was a cool leader, a good guy, right? In Ukraine, it's like 4. The divide is so immense socially and politically about how they view the history of the Soviet Union in reference to their people and how they were treated under Soviet rule and how they were treated by the regimes of Stalin and other Soviet leaders. Not even just the voluntarists like Stalin, but like even the more quote unquote ones that work together. So I always am interested in these types of perspectives, because every single time someone makes a video on Ukraine and it frames the Soviet Union like this, there's never, ever any Ukrainian involved in the project.
Yeah, it really is a cultural chauvinism that was very dominant in the Soviet Union, of the Russian people just subjugating every other nation within it.
I mean, it was like an explicit policy of the Stalin government. I mean, for example, in Crimea, people sometimes are shocked when they look at the demographic differences in Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. Some of that was caused by the last 8-9 years of people fleeing the peninsula because of the terror campaign that the Russians engaged in, and the amount of settlers that they've brought in to Crimea. But after the Second World War, the Stalin regime forcefully deported Tatars from Crimea and killed thousands of them and moved them far away from their lands. And they wouldn't only be allowed to return home until decades later. And they'd come back and their homes would be completely gone, where they would find strangers living where they once were. And the Soviet Union said, oopsie doopsie. They eventually apologized, but did nothing to allow those people to return to their old homes. For many of them, they just permanently lost their homes. And the reason why the Soviet Union did this, or the justification, was that the Tatar people were disloyal to the Soviet Union, so they had to replace them with loyal Russians. And that's what they did.
It sounds like a similar situation to what they did to ethnic Koreans in the Russian Far East.
Oh, yes. Actually, yes.
Began preparing for conflict with this burgeoning new economic power. The Soviet Union was rightly seen as a shining alternative to capitalism, and was a ray of hope for millions of average people around the world.
Wow.
And so the United States...
The Soviet Union was a ray of hope for the oppressed, unwashed masses. Everywhere, everyone reached out and said, Mother Stalin, please save me. I'm sorry, it's cartoonish. He's talking about the Soviet Union as if he's talking about like a Marvel character.
Yeah, no. There's this huge romanticization going on. Like I've met the people it's like some of the people he's talking about. Like, granted, they're like in their 70s and 80s at this point. There were definitely people who saw it as this amazing project because they were in like some very desperate poverty, and the Soviet Union had a higher standard of living. But it wasn't as rainbow and sunshines as it's made out to be.
That is how he's painting it. Thank you, Radical AC. Thank you for the primer. I know some people who would be a lot more favorable towards the earlier period of Soviet history, towards that earlier Lenin, like the earlier period where Lenin was still alive, and I'll listen to some of the achievements like gender equality. I'm like, okay, I can agree with gender equality, or look at some achievements during the space race. I'm like, these are things that you could, for good reason, respect, like accomplishments that you can respect. But it can't ever be, let's talk about some of the achievements they made, which are good, but oh my God, look at all these atrocities. It has to be this cartoonish, North Korea-ish, it was a shining example of equality and alternative, and it's just silly. A shining example.
You know what it reminds me of?
Silly.
When I went to like the Ford building in New York City, and I went to the top of it, and I saw like the big display that really hyped up the Fords. And it was like Mr. Ford was a shining beacon in the darkness during the Great Depression. It's this weird romanticism that I see with Americans.
It does sound a little bit like a biographer who's just really like fanboying over the the person that they're covering. Like George Washington was an American icon, revolutionary, rebel, renegade, and you're listening, you're like, this guy wants to have sex with George Washington, right? That's what it sounds like. It sounds like Second Thought wants to have sex with the Soviet Union.
I feel like everyone in their life needs to meet a veteran of one of these wars that gets romanticized to hell to see the trauma and the lasting impact that it has on them. It's really hard to romanticize something when you see the actual human cost of it.
I've interviewed former Soviet soldiers. The problem is that if you find somebody that really doesn't like the Soviet Union and used to be a Soviet soldier, because there's a lot of former Soviet soldiers who are actually serving in the Ukrainian military, some of them in advisory roles and other ways, those will just usually be dismissed because I think people are just like trying to look for somebody to reinforce what they already believe at the end of the day, right? And I think everyone does this to a certain extent. But I just would like people to talk about these characters and these nation states, these people, as if they weren't cartoon characters. And it just sounds like he's talking to them like it's a cartoon character. And it just shows how disconnected he is from the average Ukrainian, and how the average American communist, at least in the Communist Party USA, is disconnected from the people on the ground suffering this war.
States began its long process of trying to kill this hope, drafting war plans, and even considering a preemptive nuclear strike. This is the context in which we must analyze the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What tends to get lost in mainstream coverage of this war, or any conflict that benefits the imperialist powers, is the human cost of war. Those who sign the papers and make the decrees that send entire generations into the meat grinder will never hold a gun themselves. They'll never lose a child to geopolitical jockeying. Their lifestyle won't be affected. They won't lose their homes to shelling. Their pantries will remain stocked.
Shut the fuck up.
Always be clean.
I mean, this is bullshit.
Oh my god, no,
Putin was literally a member of the KGB. He was literally part of the brass, like basically almost his entire life.
Look, it's not. I understand the sentiment of like those capitalist pigs and the towers of power will never send their children off to die, and this is something that I agree with, right? And something I would criticize the invading, aggressing state for, since they were the one who initiated the war. The fact that Sergei Lavrov and a lot of Putin's inner circle's children are still off studying and they aren't in the trenches. Like, yeah, that's something you can criticize. But it's very hard for me to listen to second thought, be like, these barbarians don't understand the real pain of those suffering. And then they shows like pictures of the war and all these people suffering. It's hard for me to believe that he genuinely cares about the people who are getting hurt by the war when he doesn't want to listen to the people who are getting hurt by the war and are going to spread misinformation to reinforce the narratives used by the nation invading the country full of the people being hurt by the war. If he really cared about these people and this was a genuine interest and a genuine concern, then I think he would take their concerns and their comments and what they have to say about their country being invaded more into consideration. And when the polling data is so clear on what the Ukrainians want for their country, when the polling data is so clear, and not even my own anecdotal examples, because I could tell you a million different examples of Ukrainians I know.
Do you remember what happened with Hong Kong? You could show them all the polling data they'd want. You could show them every single poll in existence, and even if all of them were 100% Hong Kong people from Hong Kong do not want China to take over, they still would be like, I don't care, I support the Chinese cops.
Hakeem was really bad on that. Hakeem's video was really bad on that. Because it was, I remember the Hong Kong stuff was always just countering like, but majority of Hong Kongers don't want to be an independent country. The majority of Hong Kong protesters don't want to be an independent country. The majority of Hong Kong protesters wanted to preserve their civil liberties, which now, I mean, are being degraded at a faster pace than ever. I mean, getting arrested 5 years for booing the Chinese national anthem, what a ridiculous premise. But I'm a dumb liberal. Things like personal freedoms are things that I care about. So whatever. Anyway, let's continue.
That's true. Yeah.
But that is not the reality for the people being sent to fight and the loved ones they're desperately trying to protect from pointless escalation and random acts of cruelty inspired by the hate and bitterness of war. As with any active conflict, exact numbers are closely guarded by the combatants. But there's no hiding all the footage that makes its way to Telegram, Twitter, and other more democratized online news sources. Conservatively,
I need to pause because like all of these so-called democratized news sources would be immediately shuttered if he got his political wishes.
I don't know anything about is Second Thought like an authoritarian? I know nothing about it.
He's a Marxist-Leninist. He's on a so he's part of a podcast with Hakeem and Yugopnik called the Deprogram Pod. He pushes for Marxism-Leninism, but his main channel is like so milquetoast that most people don't know this about him.
Well, I wouldn't know. I'd have to go listen to it myself. Democratized news sources like Twitter and Instagram. I mean, it is true that governments are going to.
I think he was using the wrong word. I think he meant decentralized.
No, I think he means democratized. I think he means democratized. I think there is something to be said about governments being unable to control these types of more open source, quote unquote, intelligence platforms. I don't know if you might call it that, but definitely since it's social media, there's a very large lack of intelligence on these platforms. But there is something very democratic and very great about open source intel, but also open source intel and social media and using it as a source is also very dangerous because it's very easy to spread fakes and it's very easy to do fakes. And a lot of fakes have been produced during this war. There's been like fake crucifixion videos. There's been fake videos of the Ukrainians invading Russia proper, like at the start of the war, that would try to be used to justify the Russians invading. There have been tons of like fake videos of stuff that has turned up. And like verifiably fake. And so I am somewhat worried by social media being the primary source for a lot of people when trying to pick up news about the war, because there is an active campaign by multiple governments to spread misinformation, as well as the fact that there's a lot of bad actors that will just repost videos from other wars. Like I'll see videos come up from Syria. I'll see videos come up from like a completely separate conflicts, people claiming that it was like footage from the front line. So I'm always nervous about social media being used, but I like open source intel as a concept, and we just got to figure out how to get rid of the kinks.
Thousands of people have been killed since last year, including civilians, as well as mercenaries flying in from Western countries to hunt their fellow human beings for sport. We've seen horrific footage of homes destroyed.
Wait, can you pause that?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's referring to actual mercenaries or if he's referring to like the International Legion. There are mercenaries in the war. There are PMC contractors in the war. But I don't know if he's referring to that or if he's trying to refer to International Legion fighters. I don't know. If he's referring to International Legion fighters, they're not mercenaries. They're volunteers who are getting paid very, very little in order to risk their lives for something that they do personally care about. If it's PMC people, then, I mean, yeah, there are PMC actors in basically every war zone all around the world.
Turned beyond recognition and what looks like evidence of chemical weapons. War is a dirty, bloody business, and it only benefits the ruling class of the involved nations.
Okay, I don't...
Conscripts shipped off...
I don't know that. I'm trying to recognize that video. That video in question, I kind of vaguely remember, but I don't know if it was ever confirmed. I would have to go back and check. I'm sorry.
Which video?
The video that he was just showing on screen. He said in what looks like evidence of chemical weapons, which is a big asterisk. So there's not really much I can say, because if it hasn't been confirmed, and I've also had people tell me about the possible use of chemical weapons, there's not really much I can say about it.
Yeah, it's kind of sneaky to throw that in there if there isn't confirmation.
There's videos of people, like I've seen videos that look like thermite being used, and there's some videos that could possibly be white phosphorus, but none of, and like I've seen that. I've heard reports of white phosphorus usage from soldiers directly, but nothing has been confirmed. So I noticed the fact that he said what looks like. Yeah, nothing has been 100% confirmed.
Off to fight in some leveled city have no chance of elevated status. Their lives won't be improved by butchering their fellow workers. They will be lucky to return home at all, and most of them with scars both physical and mental that will haunt them for the rest of their lives.
He should go tell the soldiers that, actually. He should come into Ukraine, and he should go to the soldiers and say, you guys should all give up.
Yeah.
Put your guns down. It won't help you to fight the Russians, actually. Both sides.
I really want to see what his
excuse me, Mr. Ukrainian, defending your village. Have you considered both sides? I haven't considered that, Mr. Second Thought. That's a really good point. We should bring back the Soviet Union.
Yeah, maybe we just need to educate them.
Yeah, I think we need to educate the Ukrainians. I think they know very little about the war.
Yeah, it really is a shame that Second Thought hasn't made his channel more accessible to Ukrainians. They could learn so much.
They could learn so much.
Talk of democracy, freedom, national determination, and invoke some mythologized past to fool the peasants into thinking they're dying for a noble cause. They are not.
What?
Democracy is stupid. Democracy is stupid. Ukrainians don't need a democracy. If they want, they should keep their corrupt, kleptocratic Yanukovych regime. They should have kept that. They should have kept their Bakut that was racketeering them. You know what? They should have seen those gang members, literal gang members that the Yanukovych regime hired to go stab them, and they should have given them hugs and kisses, because democracy is liberal and gay and stupid mythology, because democracy is fake bourgeois nonsense. I mean, we could look at the standard of living and comparing the Western style democracies to the more authoritarian countries around the world. We could compare the standard of living between West Germany and East Germany. You know, I mean, this bastion that he was talking about, the shining example, the shining light. All I know is we didn't need a wall to keep people in West Germany. The Russians needed a wall to keep people within East Germany. And East Germany was one of the most well-developed Soviet nation states out of the entirety of the Soviet Union, one of the more economically prosperous.
Yeah, but
Soviet
Dylan, if you consider that was actually the anti-fascist defense barrier and it was to keep the Nazis out.
Wow, and it just so happened to also have the side effect of keeping the Germans also in.
Yeah, well, once you crossed the barrier, you became a Nazi, so it was okay to shoot.
That is true. That makes sense. Yes, that's why I'm sure that all the people who support the DDR also support Trump's immigration policies.
Solution to this conflict. We have seen in recent months that the United States remains the primary obstacle to peace in the region, as China attempts to broker a
Dude, I'm sorry. I'm trying not to say the R slur. That was hard. I almost blurted it out.
I'm on YouTube. I don't care. I'm on
Twitch. I'm on Twitch, and also I'm trying not to say it more. That's the only reason I mentioned it. I'm trying not to say it. I'm trying not to say it, man. I don't know what America's the primary obstacle to peace. It's not the invading army that has not changed their fundamental demands since when they first invaded, and now, if anything, have escalated their demands to include annexations. I mean, let's talk about Russian demands. They want to annex Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. They want to demilitarize Ukraine. They want, on top of the demilitarization of Ukraine, they want the denazification of Ukraine, which most analysts translate to mean regime change. Whether that's going to happen, I mean, that's impossible at this point. But that is still one of the demands they're making. And the Russians refuse to concede on really any of these demands. And so if we're saying that America is the main obstacle to peace, here's a question. People talk about the Boris Johnson quote, the April 9th quote, which was reported on by Pravda, and I'm gonna watch a Lonerbox segment probably after this where he really delves into this for my audience. But when we saw the negotiations starting to somewhat kick up in March and April, this was also the same period when all the war crimes in Bucha and all these other locations were first being revealed, and making it nearly impossible for the Ukrainian government to negotiate with the Russians. Because if you're getting report after report of your villagers being massacred, how are you going to trust those people after they've lied 3 or 4 times already about not invading and totally not going to invade and don't worry about it? Now you're going to believe them, and you're going to disarm yourselves in response to their invasion. So that would mean disarming yourselves, giving them what they want, when that's how they're treating the civilian populations in the territory they occupy. Meaning they keep on going and they occupy more territory and do that to more civilians, or they just hold on to what they have and just brutalize the civilians in the way we saw them brutalize the civilians in Bucha. Point is, right, I don't think that when people talk about the spoiling of negotiations, enough credit is given to how much war crimes and atrocities can undermine negotiations. It makes it so, your population doesn't want to negotiate.
But Dylan, if you consider that America is very bad,
I hadn't considered that. That is a good point. I'll have to consult my my other experts in the field.
The US and its lackeys call ever more loudly for increased weapons shipments and greater Western involvement. Thankfully, this conflict has coincided with the sharpening of contradictions surrounding the US. The once untouchable global hegemon is losing its grip on the rest of the world. Countless Latin American and African countries have broken ties with the US and accepted more mutually beneficial trade agreements with China. Even those countries which the US expects to be loyal, like France, are expressing doubts that the United States is a reliable partner, and are beginning to shift towards the East. What we see as a result is a desperate attempt by the US and its staunchest allies.
My God, they're literally like Chinese neocolonialism in Africa based?
I don't like I would be interested in actually listening to this guy and what type of world he would like to see at the end of the day. Like, does he think that like when America retracts, right? Because I don't believe the future of humanity is just America dominating the world forever. I think that's silly. I think there needs to be like international norms clearly established in order to guide a world that is more mutually beneficial for everyone, that keeps people following international law, doing illegal invasions, right? But when I listen to the game plan for like the multipolarity folks, I'll just call like the BRICS crowd or whatever, it seems like they just want to return to like 1910. Just like, oh, everybody has their own like spheres of influence. You can abuse those spheres of influence. You can colonize those people. That's all fine. Like the Russians can do it. The Chinese can do that if they want to. But America, they can't do it because America's
As I was thinking
capitalist.
of this,
But Russia's also capitalist. But Russia's like cool though. That's different because they're former communists.
Because the way that they're treating this conflict with Russia and Ukraine and making shit up, they're treating it like the First World War. They're like, no, this is just an inter-imperialist conflict between two economic world powers. Fuck this war. But they're also taking the side of not criticizing Russia because of its Soviet past. They would not do that otherwise.
I wonder if he would have been like during the Vietnam War, like the Soviets and the Chinese need to stop supporting the Viet Cong. Like all you're doing is fueling the conflict for this imperialist war. No, he wouldn't, because he'd be like, no, the Vietnamese people were fighting for their freedom. They had a right to have their own country. It's just the difference is Ukraine's aligned with the United States. That's the difference. That is purely the difference. Oh, and they're not like his flavor of like communist. And most Ukrainians don't like communism, so he's not going to win over the Ukrainians anyway. So maybe that's it. Maybe he knows that he's not going to win over the Ukrainians, right? The Ukrainians really don't like Marxist Leninism. So he's decided just not to sell to that audience. Like it's like like if you're Trump, you're not going to win the trans vote, right? If you're Mike Pence, you're not going to win the trans vote. Why even try?
Well, I think that's also the thing is that I talk about this a lot on stream, that the way that Westerners, like specifically like Americans, Canadians, and people in Europe, in at least English-speaking Europe, have to sell Marxism-Leninism is they take Stalinism and they add like Western identitarian politics on top of it in a way that it's incoherent, and it's not like that in other places in the world.
You know what's weird? I don't know, like I've seen a lot of weird and this I don't think Second Thought fills this group. But this is definitely true of people like Jackson Hinkle. It feels like if you're a strong man and you don't like America, no matter your political slant, you will just get support. I remember there used to be these memes about critical support for ISIS, right? There was these people who would joke about like, oh, well, we hate America so much, we're, critical for support for ISIS. And that was like a meme, I think. But then there were some people who genuinely believed it, but they were like a small, tiny group. And now I'm seeing more people like coming out just like endorsing the most brutal of regimes, whether it be the North Korean regime, whether it be like the recent military juntas in Mali and Burkina Faso, which have failed to deal with extremist terrorism in their countries, whether it be the new military junta in Niger, whether it be, I seen recently a lot of people flip on Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is more edging their bets on other allies in China and Russia. Well, not allies, but other partners and stuff like that. So it really just feels like, and before it maybe more felt like a meme. It does feel like if you're not America and you challenge America, there will be people always who will support you because you're not America. If we took that,
100%,
I would wonder if, because I know some people who take a similar position on Russia, and I thought it was stupid because I knew somebody who didn't care about Nagorno-Karabakh, which is currently under like a basically blockade from any humanitarian aid or food getting in Armenia by the Azerbaijani government. And there are some people who won't support Armenia just because Russia is their ally and Russia is giving them a security guarantee. And I thought that was silly because just because Russia is their inconvenient ally in the region does not mean that Armenia doesn't have any moral claim to defend the civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh. The idea of me balancing all of my politics off of just hating Russia, that it would almost feel like I'm just fulfilling like the fantasies of my worst critics. But that's exactly what he's doing. It's just whatever is not America, I will support that because it is not America. It is the shining other example. Communism, hurrah.
There's a lot of that. I've seen so much of that. I really want to bring something up, but I want to get through this video. There actually was an Italian Communist Party that literally said critical support to ISIS. But
there was?
There was. It's fucking insane. But I gotta see where this goes. I want to see what the conclusion to Second Thought's video is.
I'm curious too.
Weaken its economic adversaries by encouraging proxy wars in Eastern Europe and Asia. So far, China has not taken the bait, and instead has stepped into its role as a key negotiator, recently securing peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
I don't want to like rah America here or anything like that, and I want to make sure that I emphasize that America needs to realign how it engages in the world in major ways. That a lot of the ways how it engages with the international order is extremely hypocritical. I believe it needs to end the blockade on Cuba. But remember when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan?
Yeah.
It was like this old frail woman visits Taiwan, and the Chinese reaction is, we're going to fire how many missiles off the coast, we're going to do how many military drills, we're going to make how many threats, we're going to have state TV outlets talking about shooting down Nancy Pelosi's plane. Oh man, tactful Chinese diplomacy, cool-headed as always.
Yeah, that was such an overreaction. It was crazy. I want to see what happens if Joe Biden went to Taiwan and started Fortnite dancing. He'd go fucking ballistic.
It would be fun.
Arabia, contributing greatly to ending the war in Yemen, and now, with any luck, helping to peacefully resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It has become increasingly apparent that as the US empire declines, it will become ever more violent and militaristic, a dangerous situation for the rest of the world, as the United States remains the only country on Earth to have used nuclear weapons on human beings. And they did it not once, but twice. The Communist Party...
They make it sound like the US is the only country that would.
It's crazy, because like, if you listen to the rhetoric around this war, it is the Russians constantly saying, I will burn millions to death with my weapons. We will kill them all. You go on Russian state TV, that's like a nuke every capital of every major European country, show them the power of Mother Russia. And in response to that type of rhetoric reading from the Kremlin, it's not, oh, well, hey, maybe the Kremlin should, tone down its end the world talk. It's America nuked Japan. America nuked Japan.
I mean, the Soviet Union almost nuked the US. The only reason that never happened is because the person in charge realized there was a computer error.
That guy is awesome. Awesome. And because they weren't coming up for air too, so they were under like a stressful environment. They weren't thinking straight either. That guy's a mega Chad. I'm not gonna obliterate my family for something I don't even know happened.
Of the United States, and the masses of people both here and around the world, must call unanimously for an end to US involvement not just in Ukraine, but in the South China Sea, in Africa, in Latin America, and everywhere the US war machine has extended its tendrils.
Wow.
We must unequivocally say no to US involvement and no to
it'd be really helpful to the Ukrainians if they had less air defense, so it'd be easier for Russia to bomb their hospitals. And, one of the things that I've noticed once I've come back to Ukraine this time around, definitely after going back to Kharkiv, last time I was in Kharkiv, there was like 1/3 of the population there. There, like most of the restaurants were closed. Now most of them are open. And even got to visit like an aquarium and saw some dolphins. It was pretty cool. And I was trying to figure out like how this city that last time I visited was so bomb riddled changed so quickly. And there were still an average like missile strikes. There were still drone attacks, but 50 to 60% of the bombing had stopped, and it was because the artillery had been pushed back by the counteroffensive. That had increased their standard of living of people in the city and encouraged a lot of people to come back to their homes. And so I don't know how you see American weapons and American shipments to Ukraine pushing back the invading army and controlling Ukraine's airspace from an air campaign designed to terrorize the civilian population. And your conclusion is the thing that would help this situation is if America gave less support, meaning leaving the Ukrainians to get swallowed by the Russians. Or even if they don't get swallowed by the Russians, abandoning the Ukrainians for the long term because he wants us to pull back. So does that mean Russia is just going to be the one that decides Ukraine's future? Because if we pull back, and he also wants the Europeans to pull back, presumably, that just leaves Ukraine isolated with Russia with no allies to fall back upon. What would motivate the Russians to not just keep the war going, but, you know, maybe just wait 5 years, like freeze it, wait 5 years and reopen it once our tendrils, as he describes them, have been pulled back from the continent, and there's no one to come to their defense, no one to come to their aid. Collective defense is what is protecting nation states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania right now. And it's not protecting states like Moldova.
It's just like, it's maddening to me and also kind of sad, because I used to really buy into this rhetoric. But how do you defend what Russia is doing? How can you come to this conclusion without analyzing any of the things that Russia has done, considering they've been the aggressor in this entire situation?
The thing that gets me about this, it's not even that he's like necessarily defending Russia's actions here, but he says that a solution is America to withdraw its support, to withdraw its involvement. And there's no talk about the invading force, the attacker, withdrawing their involvement in the country. In fact, their involvement in the country is almost like pre-assumed. Like, oh yeah, that's their business. They do what they want. It is what it is. Soviet Union or whatever. Like that, as in that is the default. The Russians dominating and subjugating Ukraine is the default. Again, this just feels like we're moving back to, we just want to different empires with different regions that they can domineer over and do whatever they want to.
They want to bring back the Cold War because that was the golden age for their political system.
No. They don't want. I don't think they want to bring back the Cold War. I think they want to bring back a pre-World War I kind of age of empires with these different big units. And even though he's not saying age of empires, that's what it would mean in practicality. What he's describing right now, where, you know, they the powers sit around a table and describe how they're gonna cut nations in half. I mean, much like actually probably what was done to many African states as colonialization winded down.
What was done to Poland.
Or what was done to Poland. I just really feel like he put very little thought and effort into this. And that's what's, I think, most aggravating to me, because he feigned so much concern, but then said so many things in this that were just so blatantly wrong and seemed to completely ignore the desires of the local population, because the desires of the local population probably don't align with his. So now they no longer matter. Just get America not involved. That's it. Abandon them.
Always. Enough blood has been spilled desperately trying to maintain an economic order that does not serve the people. Capitalism and imperialism remain the greatest evils of our time.
That's a really good point. I think, you know, the Russians obviously shown to design a really good system for the Ukrainians. I mean, like, they could really hit like a high score of like unmarked graves. They want to top that.
Also, Russia isn't arguing against capitalism at all. They're not anti-capitalist in any measure. Oh. They're just a right-wing populist government. And
I mean, this argument makes sense if there was like a socialist alternative here. There's no socialist alternative in Ukraine.
I understand if you bring this back like 50 years and it's the actors back then, but it's like they're trying to superimpose what the world used to be like on the current situation. I guess that's how they try and view things, using historical materialism or whatever.
I just very little concern for, I think, national identity, sovereignty, because he even said this earlier, democracy, all of these things are basically spooks. They're liberal illusions. Like, none of this actually, like the idea of Ukrainians getting to vote on who their leadership is, who's their governance, that's not communism. So if the Russians dominate Ukraine, it is what it is, because it's not because it's not socialism. They just want to protect liberal capitalism, which sucks. But liberal capitalism is much better than the system that Russia is offering the Ukrainians. The other system, the integration with the European Union, is a much better system that the majority of Ukrainians want. And I think that that's the decisions for the Ukrainians to make,
not a decision for second thought or the Russians to make.